What would you do if 60 of your bravest sons were carried home beneath flags, not because of an accident of war, but because of betrayal? The heat of the Sahel pressed down on Ouagadougou as 60 coffins stood in silence, each one a mirror of sacrifice. Mothers clutched photographs, fathers clenched fists. The president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, stood without words, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "They were not just soldiers," he whispered. "They were our voices, and someone tried to silence us." The betrayal seemed too sharp to be chance. Just 4 days earlier, Western envoys had arrived in the capital, offering medals, handshakes, and the warm smile of strategic cooperation. Traoré refused. No awards, no applause, no deals. He sent them away. Then came the ambush at 4:38 in the morning. Communication severed, drones disabled, and 60 young men gone. Was it coincidence or consequence? Africa has always buried more than bodies. It has buried questions left unanswered. Who has access to the codes of war? Who decides when a nation must pay the price for dignity? The lesson of history is cruelly simple. Africa is punished not only when it loses battles, but when it dares to stand upright. And yet this time, something different stirred. The silence of mourning began to turn into a fire of resolve. Across the country, from mosques to universities, people asked in one voice, if this is the cost of standing straight, should we ever bend again? So what really happened in Dargo that night? And more importantly, what does it mean for Africa's place in a world that still seeks to command it? This is not only about 60 soldiers. This is about a nation reclaiming its breath and a continent daring to reclaim its voice. So stay with us, because this story is not only about 60 fallen soldiers, it is about the meaning of dignity itself. As you listen, let us know in the comments, what does true independence mean to you, and where are you watching from? At 4:38 in the morning, the eastern sky above Dargo cracked with fire. Within the first 2 minutes, every communication line was cut. Surveillance drones stationed nearby had been rendered useless. What should have been a routine border patrol became a slaughter. By noon, 60 bodies were brought back, each wrapped in the national flag. The silence of the convoy as it entered Ouagadougou was heavier than words. The government declared 3 days of mourning. Schools closed across all 13 regions. Public television abandoned entertainment, showing instead the names, faces, and ages of the dead. The youngest was 19, the oldest was 38. Most were fathers. All were sons of the land. Across the capital, black banners stretched across government buildings. On the steps of the National Assembly, a single line of white letters read, "They did not die in vain." Yet grief was not the only presence in the streets. Doubt began to spread like an echo that refused to fade. Just 4 days earlier, President Traoré had rejected a delegation led by American envoys. They had come with medals and gestures of friendship. He had said no, no smiles, no ceremonies, no deals. Now 60 soldiers lay dead. Was the timing coincidence or was it a consequence? In Bobo Dioulasso, elders prayed inside the Grand Mosque. Outside, men argued under the shade of the courtyard trees. "So this is the cost of standing straight," one said, his voice breaking. At the University of Ouagadougou, students painted the walls with new words. "Our dignity has a price, and we are paying it." The newspapers carried the unease into print. One front page screamed a headline that left no room for ambiguity. "Refuse the West, and they remind you who still holds the trigger." The whispers in the street were now theories, and the theories turned into anger. President Traoré did not join the chorus. He did not accuse. He did not beg for sympathy. Instead, inside the presidential compound, orders were drafted, officers reassigned, new command structures quietly signed into law. To his closest advisors, he gave one instruction: build the wall. We are not here to bury heroes. We are here to protect the living. The public did not yet know the details, but they sensed a shift. In place of panic, there was preparation. In place of despair, determination. And behind the guarded gates of power, a new chapter of Burkina Faso's defense had already begun. 2 days after the attack, while the capital still moved in silence, a gray military aircraft descended onto the tarmac of Bobo Dioulasso. There was no anthem, no press cameras, no ceremony. The ramp lowered, and 11 men stepped out in black tactical uniforms. They were Russian instructors. Not mercenaries, not private firms with secret contracts, but official trainers sent under new terms set by Burkina Faso itself. They came without speeches or preconditions. They came to work. Their arrival was not announced, but word spread quickly. To some in the West, this was the confirmation of their worst fears. To people in the villages, it was a sign that they would not stand alone. At the same time, inside Ouagadougou, something had already begun. An abandoned maintenance hall on the outskirts of the city, once used during the Sankara years, was unlocked for the first time in decades. The floor was dusty, the steel beams rusted, the lights flickered above. Yet when President Traoré walked through the gates, his voice cut through the silence. He placed his hand on the cold wall and told the engineers gathered before him, "We build here. We build now. We build with our own." Within 72 hours, trucks began delivering composite shells for unmanned aerial vehicles. They were not purchased from abroad. They were manufactured and assembled by Burkinabe scientists, mechanics, and miners. For the first time in modern history, the country was setting up its own drone program, not for aggression, but for deterrence. It was called Operation Culpalego. Operation Culpalego was not only military, it was social. Civilian halls became readiness centers. Teachers gave lessons in communication codes. Farmers learned how to read terrain for tactical advantage. Former hunters shared knowledge of tracks and shadows. Young computer science students wrote algorithms for thermal cameras. Across all 13 regions, the ordinary became extraordinary. The people were preparing themselves not only to defend, but to understand why defense mattered. Posters of the 60 fallen soldiers still hung across the capital. Their names and ages were remembered, but beside their portraits, new symbols appeared. Blueprints of drones, maps with red markers, pages of training manuals. The nation was not turning its back on grief. It was transforming grief into resolve. The reaction outside was immediate. Western embassies issued condolences wrapped in formal language, then shifted to expressions of concern. In Paris and Washington, analysts described the developments as reckless. Think tanks circulated reports titled "Russia's Advance in the Sahel." Television anchors spoke of instability, of radical shifts, of dangerous new alliances. But inside Burkina Faso, the tone was different. In Banfora, a retired colonel looked over the new defense curriculum and said quietly to a reporter, "This is not about revenge. This is about memory turning into muscle." In Kaya, traditional hunters taught teenagers how to read the land in the dark. In Djibo, software students programmed simple tracking codes for drones. Even in small villages, elders met under trees to discuss how to organize watch groups. The climax of this story did not come in one speech or one act of defiance. It came in the steady, disciplined steps of a people deciding they would never again be caught unprepared. The plot twist was that sovereignty was no longer the domain of generals and ministers. It had become a collective project. For the international community, the aftershocks were unsettling. They expected anger, accusations, perhaps revenge. Instead, they saw discipline, strategy, and a population that was mobilizing with calm determination. That calm was more powerful than fury. It signaled not instability, but a new kind of stability, one defined by self-reliance. And in that moment, Burkina Faso became more than a country mourning its soldiers. It became a laboratory of resistance, showing that dignity, once awakened, could be trained into every hand and every mind. Grief had been turned into preparation. Preparation had been written into doctrine. And doctrine was spreading through the streets like a quiet fire that could not be extinguished. The morning after the first training manuals were distributed, something began to change in the rhythm of everyday life. Markets still opened, children still walked to school, but behind the ordinary routines there was a new pulse. Burkina Faso was shifting from a country in mourning to a society in mobilization. Across all 13 regions, community halls were converted into readiness centers. Old chalkboards that once held lessons in arithmetic now displayed diagrams of radio frequencies. Wooden desks became stations for code literacy. Retired teachers, once accustomed to classrooms of children, stood before mixed groups of farmers, drivers, and shopkeepers, teaching them how to recognize encrypted signals. The transformation was rapid, almost seamless, as if the nation had been waiting for this call. In Yako, teenage girls painted a mural across the wall of their school. The image showed President Traoré with his arm raised beside a freedom tree. Underneath, the words were simple: "You fell so we may rise." Each of Burkina Faso's 13 regions planted trees in honor of the 60 fallen soldiers. 60 saplings became symbols of continuity, each carrying a name, a birthplace, and a story. These were not memorials of sorrow. They were living promises rooted in the soil, reaching for the sky. Traditional communities also found their place within this new order. In the village squares of Dougou, griots gathered around fires, turning oral tradition into chants of resistance. Their verses did not mourn, they instructed. When the nation bled, the cowards ran, but the brave turned songs into spears. Elders reminded the youth that dignity is not inherited, it is practiced every day. The Ministry of National Security restructured its recruitment system. Candidates were no longer selected only for physical strength. Now they were evaluated for adaptability, communication skill, and technical literacy. Each region received direct funding that bypassed layers of bureaucracy. Local leaders, once sidelined, were tasked with organizing supply routes, mapping red zones, and forming neighborhood surveillance groups. Political authority was spreading outward, closer to the people themselves. The effect on national pride was immediate. In Bobo Dioulasso, carpenters converted a warehouse into a training hall where young men and women practiced both handcraft and defense drills. In Gawa, retired scouts taught children how to navigate terrain under starlight. What once belonged to soldiers now belonged to citizens. The line between civilian and defender was blurring, not through forced conscription, but through voluntary readiness. This civil awakening carried political weight. Opposition parties that once criticized government policies now found themselves silent in the face of national solidarity. Media outlets that had been cautious began to echo terms like strategic retaliation and doctrine of sovereignty. Even in Parliament, debates softened into a rare consensus. The priority was survival, and survival had to be written into law. At the same time, a quiet fear moved beneath the pride. Parents wondered if their children would now grow up in a society where every classroom doubled as a command post. Priests and imams urged that readiness must not consume the values of compassion and community. Yet even these doubts did not question the necessity of change. They only asked how balance could be preserved. Outside the borders, neighboring nations watched closely. Delegations from Mali and Niger sent observers to witness how local defense centers operated. Some came away convinced that Burkina Faso was building more than a defense program. It was building a blueprint for regional resilience. The civil transformation also carried economic undertones. Markets adjusted to supply materials for training and production. Tailors stitched camouflage into robes for ceremonies. Blacksmiths repurposed their forges for drone parts. The act of defending the nation was seeping into every trade, every household, every song sung at night. For the ordinary citizen, the consequence was profound. A farmer in Fada told a reporter, "I plant millet for my family, but now I plant discipline for my country." A young student in Ouagadougou added, "We are not only studying history anymore, we are writing it." This was the true consequence of the ambush. It did not only test the strength of the army, it reshaped the soul of a people. Politically, it reinforced the legitimacy of Traoré's leadership, for he was no longer a president above the people, but a commander among them. Civically, it created a shared sense of responsibility that no foreign intervention could easily fracture. The world called it militarization. Inside Burkina Faso, it was called memory. Memory turned into practice. Practice turned into protection. The nation was no longer a spectator of its fate. It had become the author. If ordinary citizens can turn grief into strength and transform classrooms into command posts, what might happen if entire nations across Africa made the same choice? If this were your community, would you embrace such a transformation? Share your thoughts in the comments, because the question of dignity does not belong to one country alone. While villages were turning classrooms into training halls and planting trees in memory of the fallen, far beyond Burkina Faso, the tone was shifting. In Washington, the Pentagon flagged satellite data over Dargo for weekly review. Analysts debated whether the sudden mobilization was a surge of resilience or the birth of instability. Policy papers began circulating under cautious titles, warning of a dangerous precedent in the Sahel. And in Paris, think tanks rushed to release commentaries on what they called the Russian footprint. For them, the quiet arrival of 11 instructors in Bobo Dioulasso carried more weight than the planting of 60 freedom trees. Editorials framed it as Moscow's advance into West Africa, a challenge to Western influence. But inside Ouagadougou, the narrative was different. No foreign flags flew over bases. No mercenaries commanded the ranks. The cooperation was on Burkina Faso's terms, not dictated from outside. The United States issued statements of condolence, followed by concerns over sovereignty and democratic backsliding. Aid packages that had once been guaranteed began to stall. Meetings in Brussels echoed the same refrain. Burkina Faso must be pressured, sanctioned, contained. Yet within the streets of Ouagadougou, people were not asking what Europe or America would do. They were asking what they themselves would build. Across the region, the ripple widened. Mali and Niger sent delegations to observe the new training curriculum. In a closed session near the Sahelian border, the first draft of a joint defense doctrine was signed, known as the Wall of Resistance. 3 nations, once treated as peripheral, now spoke with a single voice. 3 flags, 1 doctrine, 0 apologies. A communiqué declared. For the international community, the symbolism was unsettling. A small country long dismissed as fragile was no longer reacting with dependence. It was recalibrating with clarity. Western governments feared that this clarity might be contagious. If Burkina Faso could stand without permission, what might prevent other nations from doing the same? For an older American audience, the parallels may feel familiar. During the Cold War, alliances shifted not with battles, but with ideas. During the oil crises, global markets trembled not because of scarcity, but because of sovereignty. The same question now emerges from the Sahel. When a nation decides to define its own defense, is that extremism or is it simply independence? The reactions in world capitals show more than anxiety. They reveal the fragility of an old order that relied on silence from places like Burkina Faso. That silence has ended. And when silence ends, so does control. Control slipped from the old order, and in its place, a new reality began to take shape. In Burkina Faso, the funerals of 60 soldiers did not close a chapter. They opened one. The attack that was designed to intimidate instead ignited a transformation. What foreign capitals called instability, ordinary people recognized as clarity. Across the country, grief became a foundation. Schools planted 60 freedom trees, each named for a fallen soldier, so that memory would grow into living roots. Classrooms shifted from teaching only arithmetic to teaching vigilance and resilience. Carpenters turned workshops into training halls. Griots composed verses that carried discipline in every line. In every village, people reminded their children that dignity is not inherited, it must be practiced every day. The message traveled beyond borders. Mali and Niger joined in drafting the Wall of Resistance. Observers arrived quietly from across the Sahel to study what was unfolding in Burkina Faso. They saw not a nation collapsing, but a people reorganizing themselves into a doctrine of survival. For the first time in generations, the Sahel was not a stage for foreign powers. It was a workshop of sovereignty. Yet there is no awakening without risk. Sanctions were announced. Aid projects froze. Commentators abroad described recklessness, instability, danger. But the greater danger lies not in resisting. It lies in forgetting. If vigilance fades, contracts will again be signed in back rooms, debts will again chain entire nations, and dignity will again be sold in the name of cooperation. For those watching from afar, this story may feel distant, but ask yourself, what if your community lost 60 of its sons and instead of collapsing, chose to rise? Would you call that instability or would you see it as strength? This moment is not only for leaders. It belongs to every citizen, every parent, every grandchild who wonders whether independence can ever be real. The people of Burkina Faso have answered. They turned mourning into discipline and discipline into doctrine. The question is whether the rest of Africa will let this moment fade or turn it into a continent-wide awakening. If you believe their sacrifice must not be forgotten, let your comment be a declaration. Write in the comments, "We stand." Share this story so that the voices of the fallen are not buried. And subscribe not for numbers, but as your personal commitment that dignity belongs to those who refuse to kneel. They buried 60 soldiers, yet planted 60 trees. They closed the gates of fear, yet opened the doors of preparation. This is not revenge. It is remembrance with discipline. And when history calls again, the choice will be yours. Will you look away, or will you stand with those who rise?